This video is going to present the most in-depth comparison of business intelligence tools, covering multiple different factors such as overall popularity and market share, social engagement, as well as an in-depth evaluation and comparison between features that will allow you to make the right decisions depending on your needs. So first I'm starting with the big picture analysis, which is not intended to persuade you into any particular tool, but it is some sort of data point that personally helped me in making that decision and could help you also factor in certain important features that I think might be the right ones to make the choice. So I want to point out that I don't have any affiliation or I don't have any preference for any particular tool. I've tried to be as objective as I possibly could. And if you want to contribute to this analysis or you disagree with some of it, you're welcome to do so. And I'm going to post links in the description on how you can do that. But essentially starting out with the searches, I think Google search indicates essentially how much a tool has grown in terms of interest and popularity. And I think search is generally just a good metric to understand how much people are interested in a given tool. In this example, we see that there are three tools that are the largest ones, and the other ones are sort of on the bottom. You can see them in the rank order that they have. And this link, this dashboard will be shared through a link if you wanted to look at them in more depth and understand them better, including the source data as well. So essentially, we see three tools. As you might expect, PowerBI and Tableau, as well as Qlik. We can see that Qlik has decreased a lot in terms of popularity over the past 5 years. Tableau used to be the largest one, but is no longer the largest one in terms of popularity. And PowerBI has went from half the searches of Tableau in 2017 to more than double the searches of Tableau right now. And it is important to point out also that PowerBI is actually one of the latest tools that came on this list, so it was only released in 2015 to the general public, whereas Tableau was actually released in 2003, so 12 years earlier, including many of those tools. ClickSense was also released before the 2000. So it's just important to understand that PowerBI has came in a lot later, but it's one of the most modern tools at the moment that has also transformed, that has just taken the industry by storm and has managed to dominate it. Again, this is probably to a large extent because of the large Microsoft consumer base, but it's just important to note that they have actually managed to break in the industry and dominate it right now. This is further shown when we look at the tool searches in November 2021. So we see that Power BI actually accounts for more than half of all the searches for all the other BI tools. And additionally, we see that there is a huge dominance when we actually look at total search results for the different tools. And these are the search terms that I used to understand how many search results will appear for each one. And there could be some sort of bias here when we talk about Oracle, SAP, and Google, just because they're probably unrelated searches that also appear that boost this number more than the actual tool. But I think in terms of Power BI and Tableau, it's relatively safe to assume that those are relatively accurate. So the last one is obviously not least market share, which indicates how much this tool resonates with customers and how many customers are actually engaging with this tool. Power BI again is the dominant one, followed by Tableau and ClickSense, and then there is difference with the other ones in terms of popularity versus market share, but Microsoft owns more than 1/3 of the market, followed by Tableau and ClickSense. Again, this is just a general picture, doesn't mean you should pick any of these softwares yet. So let's look additionally at social engagement, which I think complements the previous analysis by, again, demonstrating which are the most popular tools, not only by Google search, but also, and by market capitalization, but also which ones are most popular across different social platforms and have the strongest community. And I think community is one of the important factors which I want to derive from this analysis. So I've looked at social media platforms such as Reddit, YouTube in particular, and Stack Overflow, and I think Reddit and YouTube are particularly good at showing me which tools have a strong community where I can go and ask questions. Again, this has limitations because some of the tools have their own community and it doesn't necessarily mean everything, but it still highlights that there is a really strong public community related to Power BI and Tableau. And these here are the subscriber counts of the public software channels, meaning that there is much higher number, for example, of Power BI people interested in Power BI from the official YouTube channel compared to people interested in Tableau updates from the official YouTube channel. So again, you don't have to take that into account. To me, it just shows me that Power BI has a much more strong community in comparison based on this data. Additionally, we can look at Twitter and Facebook, which I don't think are particularly showing anything because people can like certain pages and follow certain pages, but they might be just following many pages at the same time and not engaging with these pages at this necessarily. But again, it shows us that there are a few tools that are particularly popular, and it could be some factor that you want to consider. And by the way, I just want to point out that for me, the reason I think these things could be important is because the way I think about it is if a tool has a large following and it has a large audience and a lot of customers, this helps promote the tool in the future. So there means there is already some traction, there is already funding for the tool because there is many customers, and it is more likely than not that large tools will have the funding and the incentive to continue developing faster than small tools that have less funding, less interest, less morale within the company, etc. Right? So this is where I think a big difference can play out, where the Microsoft team might be much more incentivized to keep adding features compared to InfoBurst, for example, which is one of the bottom tools, right? And we can see that is the case. We can see Power BI consistently also achieves higher rating, which again could be limited and there could be problems with rating system, but I've taken reviews from 3 different systems to understand which ones perform the best. And it's just another metric, once again, to take into account. That said, we've already understood that, okay, there are a few different tools that sort of dominate the market by a long shot. Super popular, super dominant, especially Power BI controlling over half of Google searches. I mean, controlling is not the right word, but owning more than half of Google searches, 1/3 of the market. So let's understand, should we actually use Power BI by definition based on this insights, or actually what are the limitations of Power BI? Why do people choose not to use Power BI? And what is sort of the situation here? Again, as I said, I don't have affiliation with any of these tools. I've used a number of them, including Power BI, Tableau, and Google Data Studio, and I've researched other ones. But my personal intuition based on the previous data is that there is almost an indication that Power BI is the most popular tool. And this analysis here also showed me that Power BI essentially can do most of the things that I could have in mind related to technical challenges, and appears to be the best standalone tool for most of the situations that you might encounter. Now, this doesn't mean that you should always use Power BI. There are situations in which Power BI is the wrong choice. But in most cases, if you're someone who just wants to bring some more analytics into your company, or you want to automate analytics, or do less processing manually on Excel files, and just start this sort of movement into an analytics or data-driven company, Power BI is most likely the right choice for you to start. And this is for multiple reasons that I'm going to cover. And again, I'm not endorsing it, but it seems to be the case based on the analysis. And as I said, anyone who wants to contribute to this analysis, who feels like it's skewed towards a particular tool, is more than welcome. And I would like to maintain this as the most extensive, in-depth, unbiased comparison of different tools. So I'm in no way trying to favor any of them, but it just really seems to be the case that Power BI is the the best choice essentially when you take these in isolation. There are a few things you might want to consider, however, and some of the limitations of Power BI that other tools might be better at. For example, some things that you might want to have in mind are that Sysense, for example, is popular for being good at embedded analytics. So a lot of manufacturing companies who track a lot of different IoT devices and collect data from a lot of sensors like to use Sysense because based on my research, it appears to be the best tools in terms of taking all that data and integrating it. Again, I encourage you to do additional research based on the technical details of these tools. But these are just some observations. Additionally, I know that tools like Oracle, SAP Analytics, IBM Cognos Analytics, those are typically tools that are being used because the existing infrastructure already has a lot of tools in that company. Because, for example, if Cognos Analytics is owned by IBM and customers already have a lot of IBM products, they are likely to also use Cognos Analytics as an extension of that. And this seems to be one of the cases with cloud providers, and I think cloud providers is also another interesting topic to cover. But essentially the point I want to make is there are certain tools that you might prefer using depending on your needs. But assuming you don't have any particular needs and you're not tied to any sort of cloud provider, Power BI appears to have a lot of the benefit. Let's look at a few particular things that people could have as needs. One of them is the deployment model. So Power BI is particularly developed to work with a cloud instance, and so the on-premise version of Power BI, although it's possible to set up an on-premise version, is actually poor and lacks a lot of the functionality, therefore making it actually not a good choice if you want it to be entirely on-premise. And some companies might want to stay entirely on-premise, put things behind a firewall, not connect to a public cloud, and that's fine. And in those cases, you shouldn't use Power BI at the moment. Maybe in the future they could become better in these cases, but at the moment you might want to use certain tools like IBM Cognos, Oracle, SAP, which are more suited to being on premise. Tableau as well is particularly suited to on premises, but again, those tools are more likely to be useful to you if you want it to be entirely on premise and offer you better functionality. Next thing is the development environment and the operating system, where Power BI actually has two severe limitations. One of them, although they're trying to improve that in the future, is that browser development is much easier, both because it's easier to start, but at the second because it's just easier to provide the same experience for everyone in the company and just place everything in the same place. You don't depend on software and creating some local files, and there just could be many more complications when you're a company trying to work with desktop instances of a certain tool. So again, this probably would be changed in the future, but at the moment, if you wanted a more seamless experience, you might choose a certain browser tool. Like Looker, for example, appears to be quite promising after being acquired by Google, and the whole Google Cloud might be a good option because you can just manage your analytics from within the browser. And you can also look at some of the other offers here as well, but essentially the development environment could be one small constraint, although I don't think it's necessarily that big of a problem. I think it would be nice to have, but it's not necessarily a deal breaker according to the way I perceive it. I think this is a big disadvantage for Power BI, that it's developed for PC and they don't have plans to make it to make a software for Mac. Although this is again, there are ways to work around this, and there are tools like Parallel which allow you to just run an instance of PC on your MacBook. So this works around the problem, and there are other options as well. So I don't know if this is a deal breaker. I think that it is an inconvenience, and if Power BI is the better tool, it might still be worth to stick with Power BI rather than going for some other tool that exists. But it is something that it would have been much better to have. And again, this would be solved once Power BI is actually available on the cloud, but this could take a while until it happens. The next thing is actually being cloud agnostic, and a lot of companies already have a cloud architecture and infrastructure, and so it is important that the tool they use is actually cloud agnostic and it doesn't lock in to different cloud providers. While Power BI is generally agnostic in the sense that you can pull data from different clouds and you can mostly work with any cloud out there. There are certain features related to the machine learning side that are a little bit more tied to Azure, and this you need to do further analysis because it's just preliminary research that I've done, and I would encourage you to investigate this further into the cloud lock-in. But for the most cases, Power BI can work regardless of the cloud, and for most cases that you have, Power BI will be fine regardless of the cloud that you're using, unless you want to do something more technical in terms of the depth of things that you want to do. Then you have database agnostic. Again, this is not a big problem because almost all tool, I believe, except Data Studio, can support any database that exists. The only difference is that for some of the tools you need a connector, which is additional step to how you work with non-relational databases, whereas Power BI can support that off the bat as far as I'm aware. And essentially this again shouldn't be a deal breaker for any of these tools, but it's just an additional convenience that can make it easier. Preferred data model is another difference between the tools. So this, depending on your technical architecture and the way you store files, the different tools prefer different ways, so to speak, of storing the data and processing and working with that data. So this could be a factor that you might take into consideration if you're working with millions upon millions of rows and you have extremely large volumes of data and you need to optimize for that. I think that Power BI is mostly fine if you wanted to use it regardless of the architecture, but I think if you're the person who is very tight on their requirements and you're designing an entire architecture, then I think you would know that and you would be able to use that to take into account what's the best one depending on your needs. But if you're just a general user who just wants to improve things and is not working with tens of millions of rows of data, then you're probably fine with Power BI. Another important thing is actually the full featured free version, and I think this is one of the most important ones, depending on the situation. I think a lot of companies are still realizing the benefit of business intelligence and they haven't heavily invested into it, although it's becoming more and more common right now. And I believe sometimes it might be the case that you're a single person in the organization who just wants to try and optimize things for themselves, right? So if you're an individual and you don't have a contract from the company, or it's complicated to convince your company to just start this entire contracting and licensing thing with different BI providers, then it might be the best option to just start out with something like Power BI, which is actually free, and you can just start using it today, right? And start processing things in your company and creating dashboards that you can then show to people, and you don't depend on anyone, and that's as long as you want to use it. So that's a massive benefit if you're just starting out with analytics and you want to demonstrate to other people in your company that this is beneficial, but at the same time just to create things for yourself without having to rely on the company to set up an infrastructure and license a software. The next thing is share with anyone on the internet. This again depends on your need. I believe that there are benefits to each company to be able to share on the internet, but then most of them don't want to display data because it's obviously sensitive and there are risks to that. And so this is something that is becoming more and more thing happening right now, where I personally would like to be able to share things on the internet in some cases, or some companies might want to share their financial information for investors, for example. So I think having that option at least could be beneficial. And just imagine that your company might want to do something that is not really necessarily related to the company, but just something to show to the public, to inform decisions, to help people outside of the company to make better decisions based on data that this company was able to collect, right? Like, take for example Facebook. Like, Facebook could make a dashboard based on non-sensitive data that just shows the usage of their platform, right? And that would be useful to a lot of people outside of the organization. So this is just one random example. But anyway, the other things become more and more similar across the tools. So these are sort of, I've ordered them based on the biggest in terms of differentiation. And then when you go further, the tools are actually pretty much all capable of, almost all of them have R and Python support. Although Microsoft Power BI is one of the leading tools in terms of machine learning, and arguably they vary in terms of their machine learning capabilities, but most of them have R and Python support. Most of them support open source custom visuals, which means you can create new visuals that can be used in the tools, and there is a community of people who creates visuals that other people can use. Now there are some limitations, like the quality of these open source visuals varies a lot, and the process of creating them is not always pleasant. So this could be improved, but there is just a functionality for it across most suppliers. Dynamic cross-filtering means essentially when you click something in the report, does the data related to that thing across the dashboard, not only in that visual, but across the entire page view, also filter depending on that, right? So if you had a store and you wanted to identify female customers and analyze female customers, if you clicked on the gender for female on one graph, does this automatically filter and sort of show you that relevant data across the other graphs? So most of these tools support that, and I personally find it a very valuable feature when I want to interact with dashboards. But again, depending on your needs, that might or may not be important, but more often than not, I think it will be important. Search with analytics is an interesting area, and I think it's becoming increasingly popular, where people will, you want to make your results accessible to anyone in the organization. So being able to query data the same way you type things in Google and just asking questions could be a massive advantage to a tool in terms of its adoption across the company. So I think this is important. Looker at the moment doesn't provide it, but I know they have plans to do that very soon, like probably 2022. This could be a functionality already, and they're part of Google, so I think it won't be necessarily a problem to have that developed. But essentially, Power BI has strong position within that space, but also this is mostly common across the tools. It just may vary in terms of quality. The data preparation tools, essentially everything else on this list, these things are still in progress, and I encourage anyone to contribute to these areas because it needs further research, and ideally people who have used these tools to contribute to that. But essentially these fields here are the same across the tools. All of them support that, although tools like tools like Tableau, for example, require a separate tool to manage these. This is still included within the Tableau license, but it's just not part of the same integrated solution. So, and then we have additional comments, like for example, and you can read this on your own time, but these sort of show sort of key points that I've been able to find either from other people or from articles on the internet, such as the Gartner analysis, that sort of are things that are particular to these tools. As I already mentioned, Sisense has the embedded analytics advantage. Power BI has a number of things going for it, like they're part of the Microsoft Power Platform, which I encourage you to check out, which I think is a pretty interesting thing to have, although the connection with the Power Platform is still buggy and there are problems around it, but it's still there. They're part of Microsoft Azure, which again is not only a benefit to Microsoft, but any company that belongs to a large cloud that has large cloud offerings, such as Google or Amazon, will have certain advantages, such as a lot of people opting into their solutions as part of the cloud offerings. But at the same time, these companies, for example, Microsoft and Google, have strong focus on machine learning and artificial intelligence, and could be one of the companies that lead the direction in visualization and data analysis in the future. And my intuition personally, again, you don't have to take that into account, but my intuition is that Power BI and Google with their analytics platform will become the strongest BI solutions in the long term. Additionally, there are other things that we talked about relating to that, but there are just some smaller issues relating to Power BI. I think one of the biggest disadvantages from my standpoint from Power BI is generally the philosophy of Microsoft, which is they often restrict the solution to either you already have to be a Microsoft Office user, you have to have a certain type of account, you have to be using like Microsoft Azure for some of the feature. So I think they're relatively unethical in that sense, that they try to lock in customers in some cases, although that's not necessarily a problem most of the time. And I think that's something you want to explore further if you're building an infrastructure and architecture. But I think that this type of behavior is not necessarily the best long term. Whereas I believe tools like Google, like companies like Google, have a generally better philosophy in terms of how they treat customers and how they provide solutions for them. So my intuition is that Power BI is not following the right ethical approaches sometimes, which could hinder it in the future and could create dissatisfaction. And they're already creating dissatisfaction with some customers, despite having created arguably the maybe best BI software of the bat. But I think that long term, a lot of these problems might stay within Power BI because of the company culture, whereas hopefully companies like Google and other companies on this list might be able to offer a competitive edge in relation to that. And another point to mention, as I said, with the cloud, I think being part of a big cloud is one of the strongest competitive advantages that will help tools like Looker, Amazon QuickSight, and Power BI stay on the top in the future. And I believe the other tools on this list will fall behind just because more and more people will want to use the same analytics tool as part of their cloud offering. And given that most companies go on the public cloud, I think that's going to be the likely outcomes. So if you choose one of these tools, I think you will be relatively safe. But it's important to point out that Amazon QuickSight is still relatively new. It will probably have all of these tools will have the essential features to help you do analytics, at least basic ones. But the difference is when you want to go more, go in more advanced features, and this is where the biggest differences are. So I wouldn't advise using Amazon QuickSight in this particular moment in 2022, but in the longer term, it might be a great solution. Or if you want to have very basic analytics solution just to make some visuals, Amazon QuickSight could be great as well. If you want to be more, be able to have more functionality and go in much more depth, then Power BI appears at the moment to be the best solution. I think the way I see it, Looker is a strong competitor and could come close and even surpass Power BI at some point. But again, the other solutions I think will fall behind over time. Sysense is another promising solution. Domo is a promising solution because they're very customer focused and have strong software. ClickSense obviously is one of the most used ones as well. So again, like many customers are happy with ClickSense, but overall my impression from this analysis and from the way the companies are structured is that having a cloud offering will be one of the leading factors determining that, and then because of the cloud advantage of Google, Amazon, and Microsoft, I think we will just see a few limited tools that will sort of drive the market in the future as time goes by. I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments as well and what you think, and I hope this analysis was useful to you and you were able to make a more informed choice on which tool to use. Again, I encourage you to add your feedback as well, and both of these links will be available for anyone to access. I want to keep this as objective as possible, and I want to integrate as many opinions as possible, so please contribute if you can, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would be really curious to hear why you chose to use different tools, and let's create discussion so that all of us can learn from each other and make better decisions. Thank you.